Oh hi, I'm the heretic. So, let's take a guy and put him on an island by himself. He's able to provide for himself just fine. There's food, water, all sorts of awesome stuff. But nobody else knows he's there and nobody's coming to rescue him. No government claims jurisdiction over him, and as such he is not subject to their predatory violence or threats thereof for failing to abide by their legislation. He's not being taxed, he's not threatened with kidnapping or being murdered. Regardless of your understanding of the legitimacy of state rule, you would agree he lives under anarchism, right? Now, let's take another guy. He works as a file clerk in a state-sponsored corporation in Shanghai, China. The state watches and catalogs his every move, thought, and action, and should his behavior deviate from what the state arbitrarily decides is acceptable, there is the very real possibility he could disappear, never to be seen again. Every aspect of his life, including his life, is leveraged by the state. Acting in ways outside of it is a daunting task at best. Claiming this guy lives under anarchism is wrong. It's absurd. You would have to be completely and totally insane to believe that he lives under anarchism, surely. Well, they both do live under anarchism. Well, inasmuch as hypothetical people can be said to, you, dear viewer, live under anarchism. I live under anarchism. Every person that has ever lived in the universe lives under anarchism. Failing to understand this is the cause of so many bad libertarian takes, such as we need a libertarian society so we can have more rights, or its anarchist variant of getting rid of the government to get more rights. I mean, I want to get rid of the government too, but that's not why. This argument assumes rights are something to be bestowed upon people. It pains me to see libertarians espousing arguments that agree with the premise that rights are a consequence of an inequality in authority when the understanding that we already have all our rights proves that false. Sure, I don't actually need the Robinson Crusoe man on an island thought experiment to demonstrate this, but putting the contrast in people's minds of the extent of state leverage over people's lives preempts the whataboutisms I will undoubtedly be flooded with in response to this video. So what does it mean for something to give or take away someone's rights? Well, let's start with the basics. What is a right? Rights are context, situations in which a moral agent is justified in using violence. For example, if someone is attempting to stab me, they are threatening my bodily autonomy. The only reason I couldn't justify defending myself is, wait, hold on a second. Why do I have to justify defending myself? The guy trying to stab me is committing the action. They have the burden of proof. So, what could this justification possibly entail? The mere physical capability to do so only proves one's physical capability to do that action. It doesn't refute my truth claim to bodily autonomy, which is fundamentally what the conflict is about. We know this because the principle of being able to pick and choose who has bodily autonomy and who does not entails all claims of bodily autonomy, or lack thereof, as equally valid. How is it possible, then, for such a person to be able to stab me in the first place if we don't know if they can grab a knife in the first place? This inconsistency disqualifies the action from knowledge, making it, well, at best, tautological. Obviously, they can still grab the knife and stab me, but such actions are fundamentally disconnected from the ends they seek to achieve through my murder. Without logic, and without the justification of that actions, whether said action could lead to the desired ends one is seeking to achieve through their actions becomes impossible to know. Without logically justifying their actions, belief that stabbing me will achieve my murderer's desired ends is just a pure guess. It's like trying to dry yourself off by opening a door. An example of means and ends inconsistency. Since my aggressor is acting illogically in a matter that threatens my bodily autonomy, I am therefore justified in defending myself. This illogical act, entailing violence, is the context in which rights exist. Perhaps this is why historical Oriental governments in the Roman Empire treated their heads of state as though they were deities, because they claimed to wield abilities that are completely impossible. They claim the ability to justify illogical action and empower their agents to do the same. Although to be fair, not much has really changed in the transition from emperors to presidents. They just wrap themselves in different flags, and we have a better understanding of the dementia our overlords pretend the head of state doesn't have. So, what does all this mean? Since rights are entailed by logic, the government can't take away rights any more than they can alter the laws of physics. This also means, though, that they can't grant them either. Think of the various times that politicians have either claimed to grant rights, or statists call on the statist priesthood to bestow rights upon them. Other examples you might see are statists who claim that rights don't exist except until a government bestows them upon people. One example of the state giving rights to people, quote-unquote, is the right to housing, being a classic example. What does that mean, though, right to housing? It's a claim that someone has a right, a context in which violence is acceptable, to acquire residence in a building such as a house or apartment. Any impediment to this would therefore be unethical. But what counts as an impediment? Is it unethical to bar people from housing because of the costs associated with creating a house or trading in it? If this is true, then it would be just to compel people into slave labor for the purposes of providing housing. This, of course, creates a problem in what counts as housing. Since I don't think it's controversial to claim there's no equivalency between a 10,000 square foot McMansion and a tarp pinned over a hole in the ground, one may think they have an answer, but how do they know they're correct? What makes it more correct than, say, a different answer? We haven't even gotten to the principal conflict between one's claim to a right of housing and another's bodily autonomy, in one literally enslaving another to provide these houses, demonstrating a logical inconsistency in the claim that housing is a right that can be provided for. Namely, the problem that providing housing is a right falls into an infinite regress when attempting to justify, literally slavery and violating other people's bodily autonomy in a continuous, unresolvable conflict. Actually, that's not quite true. The existence of the infinite regress disqualifies housing as a right from being true, meaning the conflict is actually pretty easy to resolve. But let's take a less controversial example. People have the right to speech. But is that a right that's bestowed? If so, then we have the problem that I discussed earlier. If it is provided for, then it means that in the absence of this organization that bestows these rights, one would be unable to exercise these rights at all. Yet this isn't true, because in the absence of social organization at all, people still have the ability to take means to exclude others from using scarce resources or communicate information, such as by building a fence and writing a sign telling people to go away. Rights to property and free speech, respectively. It also creates a chicken and the egg problem, where if a government wanted to bestow the right to free speech upon others, it means some government agent needed to utilize the very faculties of communication presumed impossible by the very need to grant this right in the first place. Once again, this logical inconsistency disqualifies this claim from knowledge, which is once again how we know it to be false. But where does this leave me in what I'm trying to claim? How does demonstrating that the state cannot bestow or take away rights prove in any way that we live under anarchy? Well, recall what I said earlier. If rights could be granted or taken away by governments, then rights can only exist as a result of an inequality of authority. Since this is clearly not the case, the purposes of said inequality narrow down to, just a means of subverting people's ability to defend themselves and to solidify one's claim to a monopoly on violence in a given geographical location through the use of criminal violence to dissuade both competition in violence and to claim justification for the political agents victimizing of others. The characterizing feature of state rule is the ability of rulers to bestow and take away one's rights. Yet even the most powerful, well-funded government is only as effective as a common thug at the task, which is to say, they aren't at all. All they can do is use unjustified violence to disincentivize people from exercising rights they already have. This actually brings up a very useful observation about the nature of governments, government power, as well as societies and their relationship with governments. They're criminals. Every government that has ever existed and for all time is nothing more than a band of parasites initiating violence to grant themselves the monopoly of privilege of being able to use predatory violence at the direct expense of their victims. Knowing this, are we actually ruled over by the lying sociopaths who give themselves lofty titles like Prime Minister or President? What does it mean for something to rule over us? To exercise dominion over us? If so, would that not make us their property? Well, certainly. The dominion politicians claim to have over us is comparable to slavery, and many rulers have historically brought those they claim to rule over into chattel slavery. But did they actually own their so-called subjects, or was their claim simply uncontested due to incentives that existed at the time? Because those are two very different things. As slave masters, states, and other criminal organizations act already answers this question. By instituting systems of punishment and reward, such as through what governments laughably call law, they acknowledge not only their inability to exercise exclusive control of the body of their subjects, but their exclusive dominion over it. After all, if they could not change their minds or alter their behavior, then such incentives would be completely pointless. You can't incentivize sliced bread to jump into a toaster, for example. I mean, you could certainly try, but that would be madness. Meaning either every criminal organization throughout tens of thousands of years of history, up to today, has been completely and utterly irrational in their pursuit of monopoly privilege, or their ends are impossible without acknowledging human action, free will, and at least acknowledging the reality of moral agency through their actions. With this understanding, we can see clearly that if the state did believe their subjects to be their property, their agents would not need to legislate anything to try to control their behavior. There would be no need to warp people's perceptions of reality through superstitious narratives that justice and order, that is to say the absence of criminality, is only possible through their criminality. No, they only need tell you what to do and set you loose like some mindless automaton. The point is, the essential feature of political rule is political organizations having a claim to people's persons and property supreme to all others. While states certainly make this claim and use monopoly privilege to enforce this claim, the inability to coherently and logically demonstrate it means such a claim must be excluded from knowledge. Or, to put it more simply, their claim is nonsense, and they're just making crap up. No, they don't rule over you, since what counts as rule constitutes social conditions that cannot exist. Fundamentally, how different would your life be in the absence of political rule? Ignoring the direct benefit to the lack of artificial scarcity as a result of monopoly privilege through political power, I'm speaking strictly about your rights. What would actually be different in terms of your rights? Would people never violate your rights again? Well, not necessarily, and that would imply every time the state fails to enforce its rule constitutes anarchism. What would actually be different under what is understood in the mainstream as anarchy and what is currently the status quo? What is it about modern political rule that halts speech, stops bodily autonomy, or prevents people from excluding others from scarce resources? Their ability to threaten others with violence for exercising rights that they already have after the fact. The difference between a common thug and a state agent is just a question of the scale of their organization. The presence of criminals implies nothing about your rights. Certainly, dear viewer, their presence might cause you to change your behavior, but in regards to the context in which you are logically justified in using violence, their presence or absence changes nothing. As anarchists, we need to make clear that we already have the world we want to live in. We have all our rights. Society is a spontaneous result of interpersonal interactions between individuals seeking their most highly valued preferences and making agreements as to the moral norms they wish to follow. There's nothing inherent to the existence of societies that implies the existence of criminals let alone said criminals being necessary for society's existence. Anarchist philosophy gives us the tools we need to know who the criminals are by their deeds, regardless of the nice pressed uniforms or lofty titles that they give themselves. There's really nothing crazy or radical about anarchism. We're not trying to overhaul society, or even trying to make civilization into dangerous, uncharted territory, as statists would have you believe. For God's sakes, we're the ones with the logically consistent argument against social engineering. We're just trying to make it so that criminals can't organize. Those that defend the state have the burden of proof in explaining the state's predatory actions and the magical ability politicians supposedly have to grant and take away people's rights. If they can't, well, that's all you need to know to prove that they don't know what the hell they're talking about. And certainly the state that they're trying to defend has no idea what the hell they're doing. So, let's stop pretending that the state or its agents are something they're not. We're already as free as we want to be. What do you say we take the steps necessary to make these criminals as irrelevant to our lives as possible, huh?